In the shadowed corridors of the Château de Fontainebleau, where whispers carried more weight than royal decrees, Catherine de' Medici learned her first lesson in survival. Trust no one, and always keep your enemies closer than your friends. The year was 1547, and the 14-year-old Italian princess had just become Queen of France through her marriage to the future Henry II. But in a court where beauty, wit, and noble blood determined one's fate, Catherine possessed only one of these currencies, and it was not enough. Catherine's arrival in France had been met with barely concealed disdain from the French nobility. Her Medici heritage, though wealthy and powerful in Florence, was considered merchant class by French standards. The aristocrats whispered that she was nothing more than a banker's daughter who had bought her way into royalty. Her plain appearance contrasted sharply with the ethereal beauty of Diane de Poitiers, Henry's mistress, who was 20 years his senior, yet commanded his complete devotion. Catherine quickly realized that conventional weapons charm beauty. Political alliances would not secure her position. She would need to forge her own arsenal. The young queen's education in the darker arts began innocuously enough. The Medici family had long been patrons of learning, and Catherine's tutors included some of the most brilliant minds of the Renaissance. Among them was Cosimo Ruggieri, an astrologer, an alchemist whose knowledge extended far beyond reading the stars. Under his guidance, Catherine delved into the study of herbs, minerals, and their effects on the human body. What began as intellectual curiosity gradually transformed into something far more sinister as Catherine recognized the practical applications of such knowledge. The French court of the 16th century was a hotbed of intrigue, where poison was as common a political tool as marriage alliances or military campaigns. The Italians, in particular, had elevated poisoning to an art form, with the Borgias serving as the most notorious practitioners. Catherine, drawing upon her Italian heritage and her growing knowledge of toxicology, began to see poison not as a weapon of last resort, but as the great equalizer that could level the playing field between herself and her more advantaged rivals. Her first target was not chosen out of malice, but out of necessity. Madame de Valentinois, as Diane de Poitiers was formerly known, wielded enormous influence over Henry II, and, by extension, over the kingdom itself. She controlled access to the king, influenced royal appointments, and received gifts and honors that should have been reserved for the queen. Catherine watched for months as Diane paraded through the court in jewels that had been wedding gifts intended for the queen, while Catherine herself was relegated to the shadows of her own palace. The opportunity came during the winter of 1548, when Diane fell ill with what appeared to be a common fever. Catherine, playing the role of the concerned queen, personally prepared herbal remedies for her rival's recovery. But these were no ordinary medicines. Catherine had spent months perfecting a slow-acting poison derived from a combination of mercury and arsenic, substances that would mimic the symptoms of various common ailments while gradually weakening the victim's constitution. The poison was administered in small doses over several weeks, delivered through seemingly innocent gifts of wine, sweets, and medicinal teas. Diane's illness progressed exactly as Catherine had calculated. The symptoms, fatigue, digestive problems, hair loss, and gradual mental confusion, were attributed to the stress of court life and the natural effects of aging. Even the court physicians, among the most learned in Europe, failed to recognize the signs of deliberate poisoning. Catherine maintained her facade of concern throughout Diane's decline, even going so far as to suggest additional treatments that would, in reality, accelerate the poison's effects. The death of Diane de Poitiers in early 1549 marked a turning point in Catherine's reign and in her personal development. The grief-stricken Henry II, bereft of his beloved mistress, turned to his wife for comfort and support. For the first time since their marriage, Catherine found herself in the position she had always craved, the primary woman in the king's life. But more importantly, she had discovered a method of eliminating obstacles that was both effective and virtually undetectable. Catherine's success with Diane emboldened her to expand her operations. She established what would later be known as her Cabinet Noir, a network of spies, poisoners, and assassins who operated throughout France and beyond. The core of this organization was a group of Italian expatriates who shared Catherine's understanding of the subtle arts of elimination. They included perfumers who could create deadly scents, confectioners who specialized in poisoned sweets, and physicians who could diagnose fatal illnesses that existed only in their imagination. The Queen's laboratory, hidden in the depths of the Louvre Palace, became a center of deadly innovation. Here, Catherine and her collaborators experimented with new compounds and delivery methods. They developed poisoned gloves that would kill through skin contact, perfumed letters that would prove fatal when opened, and cosmetics that would slowly destroy their users' health. The laboratory was disguised as a workshop for creating perfumes and cosmetics for the court ladies, providing perfect cover for its true purpose. Catherine's methods were not limited to exotic poisons. She understood that the most effective assassinations were those that appeared to be natural deaths or accidents. She employed stranglers who could kill without leaving marks, archers who could make murders look like hunting accidents, and even trained wild animals that could be used to eliminate targets in seemingly random attacks. Her network extended throughout Europe, allowing her to eliminate threats in foreign courts as well as domestic rivals. The Queen's reputation for supernatural knowledge served as both protection and weapon. She cultivated an image as a practitioner of dark magic, consulting with astrologers and alchemists in public, while secretly using their knowledge for more practical purposes. Courtiers who might have challenged her authority found themselves hesitating, uncertain whether their opposition might result in mysterious illnesses or unexplained accidents. The fear of Catherine's supposed magical powers proved almost as effective as her actual poisons. By 1550, Catherine had eliminated or neutralized most of the immediate threats to her position. Several prominent court ladies who had shown too much interest in the king had died of sudden illnesses. A number of nobles who had questioned Catherine's legitimacy had suffered fatal accidents. The Constable of France, who had opposed Catherine's influence over foreign policy, had succumbed to what appeared to be a stroke, but showed all the symptoms of a carefully administered neurotoxin. The transformation of Catherine de' Medici from overlooked foreign princess to feared queen was complete. But this was only the beginning of her reign of terror. The death of Henry II in 1559, during a jousting tournament, thrust Catherine de' Medici into a position she had long coveted but never expected to achieve so dramatically. As regent for her 15-year-old son Francis II, Catherine finally wielded the supreme power in France that she had spent over a decade maneuvering to obtain. But with this elevation came new threats, more dangerous rivals, and the need to expand her deadly methods to maintain control over a kingdom. Teetering on the edge of religious civil war, the young king Francis II was sickly and weak-willed, dominated completely by his wife Mary, Queen of Scots, and her powerful Guise uncles. The Duke of Guise and the Cardinal of Lorraine saw Francis's reign as their opportunity to establish Guise supremacy over French politics, effectively sidelining Catherine, despite her official position as regent. They controlled access to the king, made policy decisions without consulting Catherine, and began systematically removing her supporters from positions of influence. Catherine's response was swift and merciless. The Cardinal of Lorraine, who had been particularly vocal in his opposition to her regency, became ill during the winter of 1559 with symptoms that initially appeared to be gout. Catherine, playing the concerned mother-in-law, sent her personal physician to attend to him, Dr. Nostradamus, who served as both court astrologer and Catherine's secret collaborator, administered treatments that contained carefully measured doses of lead acetate, a poison that would exacerbate the cardinal's existing health problems while appearing to be a natural progression of his illness. The cardinal's condition deteriorated over several months, during which time Catherine gradually assumed more of his responsibilities in governing the kingdom. When he finally died in agony in the spring of 1560, Catherine was perfectly positioned to fill the power vacuum his death had created. The Duke of Guise, devastated by his brother's death and increasingly paranoid about his own safety, began to withdraw from court politics, allowing Catherine to consolidate her control over the young king. But Francis II's sudden death in December 1560, after barely 18 months on the throne, presented Catherine with both an opportunity and a crisis. Her second son, Charles IX, was only 10 years old when he inherited the crown, ensuring Catherine's continued role as regent. However, the succession also brought new rivals to the fore, particularly the ambitious Bourbon princes who had legitimate claims to the throne and the support of the growing Protestant movement in France. Antoine de Bourbon, King of Navarre and first Prince of the Blood, posed the most immediate threat to Catherine's regency. As the senior male relative of the young king, he had a strong legal claim to serve as regent himself. Moreover, his Protestant sympathies made him a natural leader for the Huguenot faction that was challenging Catholic dominance in France. Catherine recognized that allowing Antoine to gain influence over Charles IX would undermine everything she had worked to achieve. Catherine's elimination of Antoine de Bourbon demonstrated the sophistication her poisoning methods had achieved by 1562. Rather than using a single dramatic dose, she orchestrated a campaign of gradual poisoning that spanned nearly 2 years. Antoine was a vigorous man in his prime, making a sudden death suspicious. So Catherine opted for a slow deterioration that would appear to be the result of the stresses of civil war and political conflict. The poison was administered through multiple vectors to avoid detection. Catherine's agents, posing as servants and courtiers, contaminated Antoine's food, wine, and even his clothing with various toxins. Mercury was sewn into the lining of his doublets, where it would be absorbed through his skin during long court ceremonies. His wine was treated with small amounts of antimony, causing chronic digestive problems that weakened his constitution. Even his writing materials were treated with arsenic compounds that would be absorbed through his fingertips during his extensive correspondence with Protestant leaders. The beauty of Catherine's method was that Antoine's declining health coincided with the outbreak of the French Wars of Religion in 1562. His symptoms, fatigue, memory problems, digestive issues, and gradual physical deterioration were easily attributed to the enormous stress of leading the Protestant cause during a period of increasing violence and instability. When Antoine finally died in November 1562, ostensibly from wounds received at the siege of Rouen, few suspected that his death had been orchestrated by the Queen Mother. With Antoine de Bourbon eliminated, Catherine turned her attention to other potential threats to her regency. The Prince de Condé, Antoine's younger brother, and another prominent Huguenot leader, began experiencing similar health problems shortly after his brother's death. However, Condé proved more suspicious and cautious than his brother had been. He employed food tasters, varied his routines unpredictably, and surrounded himself with loyal Protestant bodyguards who were alert to the possibility of assassination attempts. Catherine adapted her methods accordingly, developing new techniques that could circumvent even the most careful security measures. She pioneered the use of delayed action poisons that would not take effect for days or weeks after administration, making it impossible to trace the source of contamination. She also began using psychological warfare, spreading rumors about cursed objects and supernatural threats that would make her targets paranoid and unstable, even if the physical poisoning attempts failed. The Queen Mother's most innovative creation during this period was what she called the Devil's Perfume, a scented powder that could be applied to letters, books, or clothing and would prove fatal when inhaled over time. The powder was made from a combination of arsenic, mercury, and ground glass, suspended in a base of exotic spices that masked its deadly properties. Catherine's agents would dust the powder on items that her targets were likely to handle repeatedly, ensuring gradual but inevitable exposure to lethal doses. Catherine's network of assassins expanded dramatically during the early years of Charles IX's reign. She recruited from the ranks of Italian expatriates, displaced nobles, and religious fanatics who could be motivated by money, ideology, or blackmail. Her most trusted agents were women ladies-in-waiting, courtesans, and servants who could move freely through aristocratic households without arousing suspicion. These women were trained in the arts of seduction and poisoning, capable of eliminating targets through intimate contact or by contaminating personal items. The massacre of Huguenots on St. Bartholomew's Day in 1572 represented the culmination of Catherine's reign of terror, though her role in orchestrating the violence was carefully concealed, while the massacre appeared to be a spontaneous outbreak of religious violence. Catherine had spent months preparing the groundwork through targeted assassinations and strategic poisonings. Key Protestant leaders who might have organized effective resistance were already dead or incapacitated by the time the violence began. Admiral Gaspard de Coligny, the most prominent Huguenot leader and a trusted advisor to Charles IX, had been slowly poisoned for months before the massacre. Catherine's agents had contaminated his food and drink with compounds that caused progressive neurological damage, making him increasingly paranoid and erratic in his behavior. When the assassination attempt on Coligny failed to kill him outright, Catherine knew that the planned massacre could not be delayed. The admiral's survival might expose her long-term poisoning campaign. By 1574, when Charles IX died and was succeeded by Catherine's third son, Henry III, the Queen Mother had eliminated dozens of rivals and potential threats through poison, assassination, and orchestrated violence. Her reign of terror had secured her family's hold on the French throne and established her as one of the most feared rulers in European history. But the very success of her methods had also created new challenges that would test her abilities. in ways she had never anticipated. The ascension of Henry III to the French throne in 1574 marked the beginning of the most dangerous period of Catherine de' Medici's career. Her third son was intelligent, cultured, and possessed of a strong will that had been notably absent in his predecessors. Unlike Francis II and Charles IX, who had been easily manipulated by their mother's influence, Henry III was determined to rule in his own right, and gradually began to distance himself from Catherine's control. For a woman who had spent nearly 3 decades eliminating anyone who threatened her power, the prospect of being sidelined by her own son presented an unprecedented challenge. Henry III's independence manifested itself in several ways that alarmed Catherine. He began making policy decisions without consulting her, appointed his own favorites to key positions, and most troublingly, started investigating some of the mysterious deaths that had occurred during his brother's reigns. The king's lover, the Duke of Joyous, had privately expressed suspicions about the convenient timing of various nobles' deaths, and Henry had begun asking uncomfortable questions about his mother's role in these incidents. Catherine recognized that her traditional methods would not work against her own son. Poisoning the king would destroy everything she had worked to achieve, as it would likely result in the extinction of the Valois dynasty and the triumph of her enemies. Instead, she would need to eliminate the influences that were turning Henry against her, while simultaneously demonstrating that her continued support was essential for his survival as king. The Duke of Joyous became Catherine's primary target in this new campaign. As Henry's closest confidant and rumored lover, Joyous wielded enormous influence over the king's decisions and had been instrumental in encouraging Henry's independence from his mother. Catherine understood that removing Joyous would not only eliminate a direct threat but would also send a clear message to anyone else who might consider undermining her position. The elimination of Joyous required Catherine to develop entirely new methods. As the Duke was young, healthy, and surrounded by the king's personal guard, traditional poisoning techniques would be too risky, as any harm that came to the king's favorite would immediately be investigated by royal physicians and could potentially be traced back to Catherine. Instead, she devised a plan that would make Joyous's death appear to be the result of his own reckless behavior. Catherine's agents spent months studying Joyous's habits and identifying his weaknesses. They discovered that the Duke was an avid hunter who often rode alone in the forests around Paris, pursuing game with a recklessness that had already resulted in several minor accidents. Catherine's plan was to stage a hunting accident that would appear entirely natural, while ensuring that Joyous would not survive to tell a different story. The assassination was carried out with characteristic precision. Catherine's agents had spent weeks training a team of archers who could shoot with deadly accuracy from concealed positions. On the appointed day, Joyous was lured to a specific location in the forest by reports of a magnificent stag that had been sighted in the area. As he pursued the phantom deer, he was struck by arrows that had been designed to appear as if they had been fired by other hunters in the area who had mistaken him for game. The death of Joyous devastated Henry III and temporarily restored Catherine's influence over her son. The king, grief-stricken and paranoid about further attempts on his life, turned to his mother for protection and guidance. Catherine skillfully exploited his vulnerability, convincing him that only her network of agents and informants could keep him safe from the various factions that sought to overthrow the monarchy. But Catherine's triumph was short. The political situation in France was deteriorating rapidly as the wars of religion entered their final and most destructive phase. The Catholic League, led by the ambitious Duke of Guise, was challenging royal authority and demanding that Henry III take more aggressive action against the Protestant minority. Meanwhile, Henry of Navarre, the Protestant claimant to the throne, was building a powerful coalition that threatened to overthrow the Valois dynasty entirely. Catherine recognized that her son's reign was in mortal danger, and that conventional political maneuvering would not be sufficient to preserve the monarchy. She began planning what would be her most ambitious and dangerous gambit: the simultaneous elimination of both the Duke of Guise and Henry of Navarre, the two men who posed the greatest threats to her family's continued rule. The plan required unprecedented coordination and resources. Catherine would need to strike at both targets simultaneously to prevent either from rallying their supporters in response to the other's death. She also had to ensure that the assassinations could not be traced back to the royal court, as the discovery of royal involvement would likely trigger a general uprising that would destroy the monarchy. Catherine's preparation for this double assassination consumed nearly 2 years and required her to call upon every resource she had developed over her decades of rule. She recruited assassins from across Europe, including Corsican bandits, Italian condottieri, and even Ottoman agents who could operate without any apparent connection to France. She also began stockpiling exotic poisons and developing new delivery methods that could be used if direct assassination attempts failed. The Duke of Guise proved to be the more accessible target. As a frequent visitor to the royal court, he could be reached through Catherine's existing network of agents and collaborators. Catherine's plan was to eliminate him during the Estates General of 1588, when his presence at court would be expected, and his death could be attributed to the political tensions surrounding the assembly. The assassination was carried out with brutal efficiency. On December 23, 1588, the Duke of Guise was lured to a private meeting with the king, where he was ambushed by royal guards who had been secretly recruited by Catherine's agents. The Duke's death was presented as the result of a spontaneous confrontation with Henry III, who claimed that Guise had threatened him with treason and rebellion. The official story was that the king had acted in self-defense when Guise attempted to arrest him on behalf of the Catholic League. But the elimination of the Duke of Guise, rather than strengthening Henry III's position, actually precipitated the final crisis of the Valois dynasty. The Catholic League, enraged by their leader's death, declared war on the monarchy and allied themselves with Spain against the French crown. Henry of Navarre, seeing an opportunity to advance his own claims, launched a military campaign that brought his forces to the gates of Paris. Catherine's final gambit had failed catastrophically. Her attempt to eliminate both of her son's primary enemies had succeeded only partially, and the survivor Henry of Navarre was now in a stronger position than ever. The Queen Mother, who had once controlled the fate of France through poison and assassination, found herself powerless to prevent the collapse of everything she had worked to build. Catherine de' Medici died on January 5, 1589, just weeks after the assassination of the Duke of Guise, and months before her son Henry III would himself fall victim to an assassin's blade. Her death marked the end of an era in French history and the conclusion of one of the most ruthless and effective political careers in European history. The woman who had once been dismissed as a merchant's daughter had shaped the destiny of France for over 4 decades, using poison and murder to maintain her family's grip on power. Her legacy would influence European politics for generations, serving as both an inspiration and a warning about the corrupting influence of absolute power and the deadly consequences of political ambition, unchecked by moral restraint.